A woman I had never seen before knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening in October, and when I opened it, she looked at me and said, "I'm Olivia's biological mother." I remember the exact way the light looked on the porch that evening, the way the October air felt, the sound of Olivia's cartoons coming from the living room behind me. I remember all of it with the kind of clarity that only comes when your body understands before your brain does that something significant is happening. I had adopted Olivia 14 months earlier. She was 8 years old now, small for her age, with dark eyes that noticed everything and a laugh that could fill a room, and she had been mine in every way that mattered for just over a year. I stood in the doorway and I said, "I'm sorry, who are you?" And she said it again, quietly and without aggression, just a statement of fact. "My name is Hannah. Olivia is my daughter. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just need to talk to you." I didn't open the door any wider. I stood there and looked at this woman, who was younger than I had expected, maybe late 20s, and she looked tired in a way that went deeper than just the evening. And she had her hands clasped in front of her like someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was trying very hard to hold it together. I said, "How did you find us?" She said, "It took me a long time. I'm not going to pretend I didn't look." The adoption had been closed. That was the word the agency had used, closed, meaning no contact, no information shared, a clean separation that was supposed to protect everyone involved. I had understood at the time that this was standard, that it was designed to give the child stability and the adoptive parent security, and I had never questioned it because I had never needed to. Until this moment. I could hear Olivia in the living room, the sound of her program, her occasional small laugh at something on the screen, and I thought about how close she was and how completely unaware she was of what was happening 6 feet away at the front door, and something in my chest pulled very tight. I said, "She doesn't know you're here." Hannah said, "I know. That's why I came to you first." I looked at her for a long moment. And then I said, "Give me a minute," and I closed the door, not all the way, but enough, and I went to the living room and told Olivia I needed to make a quick call and asked her to stay put. And she said okay without looking up from the screen the way 8-year-olds do when they are absorbed in something, and I went back to the door. I opened it wider this time. I said, "You can come in. But we talk in the kitchen, not the living room." She nodded and came inside, and she looked around the hallway with an expression I found difficult to watch, something careful and hungry at the same time, and I led her to the kitchen and closed the door, and we sat down at opposite ends of the table. She looked at the drawings on the refrigerator. Olivia's drawings, the ones she brought home from school, the ones she did on weekends when she was in one of her creative moods, all those crayon landscapes and stick figure families, and one ambitious attempt at a horse that looked more like a very confident dog. Hannah looked at them for a long time without saying anything. And then she looked at me and said, "She looks happy." In the photos I found. "She looks really happy." I said, "She is." Hannah nodded, and something in her face shifted, some tension releasing, and she said, "That's all I needed to know, actually. But I also need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no." I looked at her across the kitchen table, this young woman who had given up her daughter 4 years ago and spent what was clearly a significant amount of time and effort finding her, and I said, "I'm listening." She didn't ask for what I expected her to ask for. I had been sitting there preparing myself for the thing I was most afraid of, the request to take Olivia back, the legal threat, the complication I had spent 14 months quietly dreading without ever quite letting myself think about it directly. But that wasn't what she said. She said, "I don't want to take her from you. I want you to know that first, before anything else. She's yours." I made a decision, and I stand by it, and I'm not here to undo it. I looked at her and waited. She said, "I just want to know if there's any possibility, any at all, that I could be part of her life in some small way. Not as her mother. I know I'm not her mother. But as someone who loves her. Someone she knows exists and can come to someday if she ever has questions that only I can answer." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the door I could still hear the faint sound of Olivia's program, her world continuing on the other side of that door exactly as it had been before any of this started. I said, "Why did you give her up?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a real question, and Hannah heard it that way because she answered it without defensiveness, just honestly, the way someone answers a question they have been asking themselves for a long time. She said she had been 23 when Olivia was born, alone, in a situation that had collapsed around her in the months before the birth. The relationship had ended badly, the financial situation was impossible, the support she had expected from her own family hadn't materialized in the way she needed it to. She said she had spent 3 months after Olivia's birth trying to make it work, trying to find a way to keep her. And eventually she had understood that what she wanted to be able to give Olivia and what she was actually able to give her were two completely different things. She said, "I made the decision I thought was right for her. Not for me. For her. And I have lived with it every day since." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about Olivia in the living room, about the questions she had started asking in the last few months, the careful questions that 8-year-olds ask when they are trying to understand something big without quite having the vocabulary for it yet. She had asked me once, on a Sunday morning over breakfast, whether her first mummy had loved her. I had said yes, I believed she had, and Olivia had nodded and gone back to her cereal, and I had sat across from her and hoped with everything I had that I had said the right thing. I said to Hannah, "She asks about you. Not by name, she doesn't know your name, but she asks about her biological mother. She wants to know if she was loved." Hannah closed her eyes for just a second. And then she opened them and said, "What did you tell her?" I said, "I told her yes." Hannah looked at me across the table and her expression was something I don't have the exact words for, gratitude and grief and relief all at once, and she said, "Thank you. That's the most important thing anyone has ever said to me." We sat in the kitchen for another hour. We talked about what it would mean, practically, for Hannah to have some presence in Olivia's life. Not a constant presence, not a confusing one, something small and honest and age-appropriate that Olivia could hold on to without it destabilizing what she already had. We talked about what Olivia would need to understand and how to explain it in a way that an 8-year-old could process without being overwhelmed. And then I said, "I need to ask her. Whatever we decide here, she gets a say in it." Hannah said, "Of course. That's the right thing." I went to the living room. Olivia looked up when I came in and immediately noticed something in my face, the way children do when they are attuned to the adults they love, and she said, "What's wrong?" I sat down next to her on the sofa and I took her hand and I said, "Nothing is wrong. But I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to know that whatever you feel about it is okay." She looked at me with those dark eyes that noticed everything and she waited. I said, "Your biological mother is here. She came to see how you were doing. She doesn't want to take you anywhere. She just wanted to know if you were happy. And she wanted to know if maybe, someday, you might want to meet her." Olivia was quiet for a long moment. She looked at our hands, mine and hers, and she turned my hand over and looked at it the way she sometimes did when she was thinking hard about something. And then she said, "Is she nice?" I said, "I think she is." She said, "Does she know I like horses?" I said, "I don't think she knows that yet. But you could tell her." Olivia thought about this for another moment. And then she looked up at me and said, "Can you stay with me when I meet her?" I said, "I will be right next to you the whole time." She nodded, just once, and then she stood up and straightened her sweater the way she always did when she was preparing herself for something, this small serious gesture that I had come to love completely, and she said, "Okay. I'm ready." I brought her to the kitchen doorway and Hannah stood up from the table when she saw her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They just looked at each other, this woman and this child who shared a face and a history and a silence of 4 years. And the kitchen felt very full of something that didn't have a name. Olivia looked at Hannah for a long moment. And then she said, "I have a horse drawing on the fridge. I did it myself. Do you want to see it?" Hannah said, "I would love to see it." And Olivia walked to the refrigerator and pointed to the drawing, the ambitious horse that looked like a very confident dog, and explained it with great seriousness, and Hannah listened with her whole self. And I stood in the doorway of my kitchen and watched the two of them standing side by side in the light, and I kept my hand on the door frame to hold myself steady.